David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So in what was completely predictable news from day one, Donald Trump claims to have fired his third national security advisor, erratic, pro-war, maniac, chicken hawk, John Bolton. And when I say claims to have fired, I say that because Bolton is claiming that he wasn't fired, but he actually resigned, and Donald Trump only later announced it as a firing in order to save face, which would not be an uncommon move for Donald Trump. Here's the story first, as per Trump, presented obviously on Twitter, where Donald Trump tweeted yesterday, "I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration. And therefore, I asked John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service. I will be naming a new national security advisor next week." Now, on the other hand, John Bolton's take on it is different. John Bolton tweeting, quote, "I offered to resign last night, and President Trump said, let's talk about it tomorrow." So this disagreement about whether it was a firing or a resignation is not an uncommon one in diplomatic circles and in administrations that are riddled with controversy and farcical positions being held open for long periods of time and a revolving door cast of characters. But there are close to like a dozen different and accurate reactions that we could have to this, because there are so many different kind of layers to the John Bolton-Donald Trump relationship. First, obviously, from day one, just knowing Trump's personality and knowing John Bolton's personality, it was completely predictable that the combination of Trump and Bolton was never going to work long term. And in some senses, it's a shock that it worked as long as it did, to the extent that it did, and it doesn't appear to have been working very well. Secondly, Bolton was a terrible choice on policy from the get-go. So there are ways in which Bolton out isn't bad per se, but as usual with Donald Trump, an empty position can be bad because it allows Donald Trump to do whatever the hell he wants with no or very little pushback. Very often when Donald Trump gets rid of someone who is bad, they end up being replaced with someone that is even worse. So in that sense, it's kind of a delicate and complicated situation. Now, number three is the broader theme here, which is the chaos in the Trump administration at the highest levels. Donald Trump will soon be, if he actually does select someone next week, as he claims that he's going to, Trump will be on his fourth national security advisor in his first term. And there's also a really good chance that the position ends up unfilled for a long period of time, which has been another trend and theme of the Trump administration. So if we were to zoom out, the theme or trend is incompetent people, either in way over their heads or just terrible people on policy, pushed into positions where they don't get along with Trump, ultimately fired or resign, a constant revolving door of incompetent, unqualified, or otherwise terrible people for jobs, and or that being happening in conjunction with positions just being empty for long periods of time, which is also a terrible thing in a number of different ways, which we've discussed. Now, number four may be the most immediate question in terms of impact in the short term, which is, what does John Bolton's departure mean in terms of the possibility of a specific military engagement or war somewhere on planet Earth? Because instinct is not incorrect in that Bolton is a warmonger who very likely could have been pushing Donald Trump towards war in a lot of different places. And now that Bolton is gone, is Donald Trump less likely to get involved in certain conflicts? Maybe, but it's not nearly that simple. It could merely be that Donald Trump will want to do different military engagements than John Bolton would have wanted. When you look at the actual areas of conflict and disagreement between Donald Trump and John Bolton, it's all potentially worse without Bolton, which is scary to say, but maybe not. I mean, I'm not speaking rhetorically here. Who to negotiate with was something that Donald Trump and John Bolton didn't agree with. There was a split that developed between Bolton on one side and Pompeo and Trump on the other side when it comes to who should we be negotiating with and who should we not be negotiating with. Bolton was skeptical about Donald Trump's approach to North Korea, which is logical on the one hand, because Donald Trump's approach to North Korea has been a joke where Trump has gotten absolutely nothing, but thinks that he's won something major. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un continues to pull the wool over Trump's eyes. But just because Bolton disagreed with Trump's terrible take on North Korea doesn't mean that Bolton's would have been better. Bolton's might have been, let's bomb people. Let's start getting even more aggressive with North Korea. Bolton said, don't pull troops from Syria, which, I mean, this is crazy. I would love to get our troops out of Syria, but the way in which Trump did it completely haphazardly, not as part of any kind of broader plan, was also terrible. So, like, were we better off with Bolton on Syria, or are we better off without Bolton on Syria? I don't know the answer. Disagreements about whether to try to meet with Iran. So what's completely outrageous about the situation in which we find ourselves is that Bolton's ideas on most foreign policy issues are horribly backwards, but he was fighting against Trump, whose ideas and implementation of those ideas is often just as backwards or even more in slightly different ways than John Bolton represented. It's unclear who we are worse off with, Donald Trump or Bolton, when it comes to national security, which is a stunning 2019 to be living in. I want to be clear, I'm not defending Bolton. I think the guy is one of the worst chicken hawks who, I actually understand why he avoided going to Vietnam. I would have done the same thing if I was potentially draftable at the time. But he was talking about how it was something he wanted to do, even though he believed that it was lost. He was one of the big advocates for all sorts of military engagements, despite having himself gotten out of them. And again, I understand why one would do that, but this is not the type of guy you want making national security decisions. Bolton was one of the primary people involved in the neocon plan to invade Iraq twice, sold the idea to George W. Bush. I mean, truly, truly terrible. And yet he at least understands a few more things than Donald Trump and may have been slightly less bad on some issues. It's a really perplexing geopolitical sort of status quo or circumstance these days. Who wants to set the over-under, by the way, on how long this position stays open? Donald Trump said next week he would be selecting his fourth national security advisor in his first term. Do we believe that? Do we believe that that person is going to have a fighting chance of actually being confirmed to the position? I don't know. I guess we'll know in about a week's time. Let me know what you think. You know how the right loves to talk about triggering the liberals, owning the libs, and it's all extremely childish and unproductive when it comes to furthering political discourse. I agree with all that. And yet I still find it endlessly entertaining to see Donald Trump so easily triggered by reality, including the reality of his terrible and diving opinion polls and his plummeting approval rating. So let me set this up for you so that we're all on the same page. Presidential approval. Presidential approval ebbs and flows. It rises and falls. And very often it will find kind of a relatively predictable range over longer periods of time, like a year or a presidential term, except when really out of the ordinary things happen. So like 9/11 under George W. Bush was one of those extraordinary and unique things that can shift presidential approval outside of its normal range. So ABC Washington Post recently released a joint poll on approval rating for Trump, and it once again shows that recently Donald Trump's approval is falling. People really think the guy is genuinely doing a bad job in a number of specific areas, including the economy, trade, and so on. And Donald Trump erupts on Twitter yesterday and today, claiming that this is something even that lawyers maybe should be involved in, because it's another one of these fake polls that Donald Trump gets extraordinarily conspiratorial about, and goes into these unhinged tweet rants where he seems to be completely disconnected, that is, from how polls actually work. Here is Donald Trump tweeting yesterday, quote, ABC Washington Post poll was the worst and most inaccurate poll of any taken prior to the 2016 election. When my lawyers protested, they took a 12-point down and brought it to almost even by election day. It was a fake poll by two very bad and dangerous media outlets. Sad. These complaints are so flaccid, so feeble, so puny and fragile that only the most uninformed and intellectually insignificant followers could possibly fall for this stuff. The polls are fake. This is the most inaccurate poll. Everything is always completely hyperbolic and unbelievable from this guy. And the truth is, there's nothing controversial about this ABC Washington Post poll. It shows the same thing that most serious polls show. It shows that Donald Trump's high approval during his term was about 44%, pretty normal for an unpopular, incompetent president in our hyper-partisan environment. And on the downside, the Donald Trump approval rating sort of has bottomed out at around 37, 38%. And that's where it is right now. It has steadily dropped over the last several months to 38%. This is not a rare or unusual low point for a totally incompetent president in, once again, a hyper-partisan environment where something like 20% of the population will always say they support the president. You've got another 8 to 15 who will be sort of on and off about approving of the president. And there's just nothing remotely hard or difficult to believe about this. Trump ranges from about 36, 37 to 43, 44 in all serious polls. Lately, there are recession fears. There's the China tariff stuff. There's the Alabama Sharpie fiasco, which is just embarrassing. So Donald Trump's embarrassments continue and polling is a little bit lower. What is there even to disagree with here? And then Donald Trump this morning continuing the onslaught of just erratic tweets, a brutal assault on the English language that Donald Trump has been participating in for years now, saying, quote, in a hypothetical poll done by one of the worst pollsters of them all, the Amazon Washington Post ABC, which predicted I would lose to Crooked Hillary by 15 points. How did that work out? Sleepy Joe, Pocahontas, and virtually all others, it's so hard to take this seriously, would beat me in the general election. This is a phony suppression poll meant to build up their Democrat partners. I haven't even started campaigning yet, and I'm constantly fighting fake news like Russia, Russia, Russia. Look at North Carolina last night. Dan Bishop, down big in the polls, wins. Easier than 2016. Donald Trump would be more popular if he just got off Twitter and was less visible. It's sort of like the referees in sporting events. If you're talking about the referees, that's probably a sign that the referees are causing problems for themselves. In the same way, if you don't notice the referees, you probably default to they're doing an okay job officiating this game. In the same way, if you're aware of Donald Trump erratically tweeting about this, that, and the other thing all the time, it's not helping Trump. And when you look at the Russia probe, if Trump had just stayed silent on Russia, not tweeted about it, not attempted to obstruct all the time, it would have gone much better for him. So here's my question to you. Am I immature for finding Donald Trump being so easily triggered to be hilarious? I'm a regular critic of the way in which political discourse has devolved and coarsened. I want depth. I want to talk issues. I want to depropagandize media. I mean, all of it. But at the same time, when I see Trump triggered so easily daily, like the guy has the thinnest skin, I find it hilariously entertaining. Tell me if I'm a bad person because of that. Tell me if I'm immature. I want to hear from you. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And the David Pakman Show is also now on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. Make sure if you have an Amazon Prime subscription to subscribe with Twitch Prime to twitch.tv/David Pakman. It costs you nothing, but it supports our show. And that's where I will be streaming commentary live tomorrow evening of the third 2020 Democratic primary presidential debate. We will see you then, and also back in a couple of minutes with much more to discuss today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are William Ruiz and Joanna Nee. William and Joanna, really appreciate your support. Membership, of course, continues to be the #1 funding source for our program, and it takes just a minute and costs only a few bucks a month at www.joinpakman.com. I hope that when you do sign up, you will stay. And someone who has done that for almost 5 years in a row is Nicholas Story. Nicholas is today's longtime sustaining member of the day and has been with us almost 5 years. The normal prices are very reasonable, but we do have a coupon code available. That code is This Is 2020, which will save you 40% off of the cost of a membership if you want it. Okay, let's get to Hatriot Mail. This may be the rare left-wing Hatriot Mail, at least to some extent. Before we get to that, a quick reminder of what Hatriot Mail is.
Because it's time to make America hate again. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So I recently was hearing from a few people who said, do you ever get left-wing hate mail? And I do, but it often does not lend itself to Hatriot Mail. I think that this week's Hatriot Mail may qualify as left-wing Hatriot Mail. Take a listen to this.
I'm not a fan of Trump. Buit, soy boy, and Tifi types really get to me. President Trump isn't doing us badly. What is the point of criticizing? So some communist hack can get in? Bernie, Lizzie? The only Dem that makes sense is Tulsi, and the Dems already screwed her. You'll never learn, huh? Trump 2020 is the result. Have fun with that. I'm leaving the country.
So someone who is threatening to leave the country over Donald Trump being reelected, who says Tulsi is the only good choice and doesn't like what I'm doing and talks about soy boy Antifa stuff, this seems like the closest to left-wing Hatriot Mail that we've received, right? At least to some degree. I guess it's at least ostensibly or putatively left-wing Hatriot Mail. It's rare, but I guess it does exist, and here it is, apparently from a Tulsi supporter, no less. Make sure that you know the way to fight patriotism in your community. Use the coupon code HATRIOT40, HATRIOT 40. When you sign up at joinpakman.com, you will save 40% off of a membership, and it sends a message to the Hatriots that you will not be intimidated by their patriotism. Thank you. When we talk about a recession, we're usually talking about the state of the American economy in total in some kind of broader sense. And we are not there yet. I mean, today, we do not appear to be in a recession. There are concerning signs that we've talked about, but it would not be accurate or at least defensible broadly to say that the country is in a recession right now. But there are parts of the country that are in a recession. And at this point, that is really impossible to deny. And the recession that exists already in parts of the country are very highly connected to Donald Trump's trade war with China. They're also connected to things like automation and some other things that are bigger than Trump. But Donald Trump's trade policy is certainly precipitating this. So let's first start with what is the definition of a recession? A recession is a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and industrial activity are reduced, generally identified by a fall in GDP in 2 successive quarters. You need only look at places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and a number of other states, specifically in the industries of agriculture and manufacturing, to realize that we have a regionalized agricultural and manufacturing recession right now. It's happening right now. This is not maybe at some point in the future, okay? You have farms and farmers themselves experiencing drastically reduced trade and industrial activity, to borrow the terminology from the definition of recession, because of a fall in their production as a result of the trade war. You then have the sequential effects of related drops in industrial activity at companies that make farm equipment, companies like Kuhn and John Deere. Kuhn recently furloughed hundreds of employees for 2 weeks because they have slowed down production as a result of farmers being hit by the trade war. The trade war, by shrinking farm trade, is shrinking the economic activity of companies like Kuhn and others, so they are forced to cut production. And when you zoom out a little bit and you look at the index of manufacturing activity, you see a contraction last month for the first time in 3 years. When you look at manufacturing jobs, the number of new manufacturing jobs has dropped from 170,000 added at this time last year to just 44,000, barely enough to keep up with population growth. This is stagnation. In 22 states, the number of people working in factories has fallen in the first 7 months of 2019, according to the Economic Innovation Group. So are we in a recession right now as a country? We cannot say that at this point in time. At some point soon, we may be able to say it. Is agriculture and manufacturing in a recession in a lot of the country? Yes, it is. It is a regionalized recession that's happening right now. And you can actually go further. There are places where the 2008 recession never really ended, the economically ravaged places in the Midwest and elsewhere that simply never fully recovered and are now already getting hit again. Now, in fairness, one of the things that I try to be consistent about is whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, I assign blame only to the extent that it is warranted. And when there are things that are bigger than who's in the Oval Office, I tell you, part of what's going on is bigger than Trump. It's bigger than Trump's policy. There is something called creative destruction. This is a mechanism in the business cycle. This was the term creative destruction, I believe, comes from Marx, but it meant something else. Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, no left-winger by any means, sort of took the term and described it as an inherent feature of capitalist economies, which is the constant revolutionizing of the structure of the economy by changing the dynamics of it. And there is some degree of that. The United States is experiencing that. There's a move away from manufacturing in general. There's a move towards tech and information and other sectors. Parts of what we're seeing right now in manufacturing could be certainly influenced by creative destruction, by automation. That is not Donald Trump's unique fault either. But the bottom falling out this quickly, specifically because of Trump policy, at a faster rate than it would otherwise, and nothing is being done big picture other than throwing some subsidies at some farmers, that is Trump. Trump's trade war, according to an estimate from Moody's, has killed 300,000 jobs in total. So this is not good. This is, of course, potentially the early indicator of things to come, not in a recession right now broadly, but we don't have to hypothesize about the future because we have a regionalized manufacturing and agricultural recession happening right now. Go and look at the really good interviews with farmers and manufacturing companies, farm equipment manufacturing companies that media outlets like NPR have done. It's really good work. It's happening right now. And to pretend it isn't is a disservice to so many workers that are already being affected by what's taking place. We will be talking more about this on our Instagram page at David Pakman Show, which I encourage you to follow. You can also follow me while you are there at david.pakman. We will take a very quick break and be back with a lot more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Here's something interesting. 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren has now taken the lead in a new CBS primary poll, not nationally, but specifically in the state of New Hampshire, which is an important primary state. It's the second to vote in the primary season after Iowa's caucus. So let's dig into this particular primary today and talk about the polling and some of the dynamics that are going on. So yes, the poll is within the margin of error. Elizabeth Warren, 27, Joe Biden, 26, Bernie Sanders, 25. But the momentum is really with Elizabeth Warren in New Hampshire. If you think back to late May, early June, that's just a few months ago, she was in fourth place in New Hampshire, polling about 8%. And she's roughly tripled her support there. And the importance of New Hampshire is maybe more significant for Bernie Sanders than for anybody else. We've talked about this before. Bernie Sanders is a senator from Vermont, previously a congressman from Vermont, previously a mayor of Burlington, Vermont, well-liked by Democrats in New Hampshire merely because of the proximity of Vermont to New Hampshire. Back in 2016, Bernie Sanders won easily in the New Hampshire primary against Hillary Clinton. You might recall Bernie got more than 60% of the vote over Hillary Clinton's 38. And yet he still didn't win the general primary and become the 2016 Democratic presidential nominee. So when we see Elizabeth Warren surging in this way in New Hampshire, it is an interesting monkey wrench, and there are two opinions about the importance of New Hampshire. One view about what's happening in New Hampshire right now is, listen, Bernie crushed it in 2016 in New Hampshire. This is the neighbor state to his home state of Vermont. If Bernie doesn't win in New Hampshire, it bodes very poorly for Bernie Sanders. It bodes very poorly for Bernie Sanders in the broader 2020 Democratic primary. That's one view. The other view on New Hampshire is it's just New Hampshire. Yes, it's an early primary. Yes, it's close geographically to where Bernie Sanders is a senator. But in the end, it's a very small primary. It is not actually going to tell us very much big picture. The other view is that it's sort of something in between. Now, we have to have all of the normal caveats here. First of all, number one, yes, Elizabeth Warren is in first place, but statistically, this is a tie. It's within the margin of error with Warren, Bernie, and Biden separated in total by only a couple of points. But the momentum is certainly going in the direction of Elizabeth Warren. Number two, this is also only one poll. I mean, all the other New Hampshire polls still show Joe Biden ahead. Gravis, or someone else ahead, rather. Gravis has Bernie +6. Emerson has Biden +3. However, on the other hand, Warren is pulling a big lead in New Hampshire as the second choice for voters. So aside from reminding us that some version of ranked choice voting would be a great idea, consider that 25% of New Hampshire Democratic primary voters say Warren is their second choice, followed by Bernie at 17%, Buttigieg at 13%, and then Harris and Biden tied at 12%. Now, there is something interesting developing with Elizabeth Warren, not just in New Hampshire, but more broadly. And I have been getting emails from people saying, David, you've got to talk about this. Elizabeth Warren is unquestionably becoming more and more the safe status quo progressive candidate. Now, what I mean by that is Joe Biden is obviously the total status quo establishment Democratic candidate. He straight up told rich donors behind closed doors, if I win, nothing is substantively going to change for you in terms of your privileged position in society. We know that with Biden. Bernie and Warren are the strong progressive candidates in the Democratic primary. Now, I've talked with you before about how even though on policy, Bernie and Warren end up in very similar places, particularly domestic policy, Bernie ends up there pulled right from his kind of tear it all down and build it back up mentality that he comes from. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, ends up there being pulled left from her center left. Let's make changes to the system and make it work better for more people. Faced with the reality that Joe Biden may fall in the 2020 Democratic primary, I'm reading more and more about Elizabeth Warren being seen more as the safer to the status quo progressive candidate on issues ranging from healthcare to the financial industry and taxation and others. So my question for you today, basically there's two questions for you today. Number one, do you believe that this assessment of Elizabeth Warren is accurate? In other words, do you see Warren as, within the strong progressive candidates, Bernie and Warren, the one that is safer to the economic and broader status quo? And if you don't, tell me why not. Okay, let me know. I want to hear from you about this. There is a stunning new poll out of Texas, which is also sort of not stunning if you've been paying attention for the last 10 years. And what the poll tells us is that Texas is no longer a safe Trump state in 2020. This is extraordinary, and the implications are wide-reaching. There's a new Univision poll which shows that 40% of registered Texas voters now say they will vote for the Democrat that ultimately wins the primary instead of Donald Trump. Only 33% say that they will vote for Donald Trump in Texas. Once you include undecideds who are leaning one way or the other, the advantage definitely shrinks. It becomes Democrat 47 Trump 42. Now, that is only 89% total. That still leaves 11% gray area, but it doesn't matter because these numbers are already, even accounting for that 11% that is fully undecided, this is already a massive change from years past. This is something we've been talking about for a very long time. Texas could become a swing state, a purple state, and Donald Trump might be accelerating that to happen even sooner. And a big part of that, as we've been following for years, will be the effect of Hispanic voters who plan to vote for the Democrat, whoever it is, over Donald Trump by a 69-19 margin in Texas. That is a 50-point margin to Donald Trump's disadvantage among Hispanic voters in Texas. Now, let's be crystal clear. This does not mean I expect Donald Trump to lose Texas in 2020. Republicans win Texas often. They've been winning it for a very long time. But if it's even remotely this close, it signals really bad things for Donald Trump nationally. In 2016, Donald Trump won Texas over Hillary by 9 points, okay? 52-43. In 2012, even though Barack Obama won hugely at the national level, being reelected, of course, Barack Obama lost Texas to Mitt Romney 57-41, a 16-point deficit. What that tells us is that if it's even close in Texas, if Trump wins Texas, but only by 2, 3, 4, 5, it is really bad in terms of what it signals for Donald Trump nationally. And this is actually, Texas is sandwiched in a bigger story, which is developing, which is that if we get the vote out, and that is a very big if, there's a massive opportunity to put in play states that are not usually in play. All those possibly future purple states are potentially winnable in 2020. Georgia could be in play. Trump won Georgia in 2016, but he trails a generic Democratic challenger there, according to a poll from 8 weeks ago. North Carolina, same thing. Donald Trump won it in 2016. Trump is losing by 5 points to an as yet unnamed generic future Democratic nominee. Then you've got Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which are always in play for the Democratic candidate if we actually go and try to win them. The polling, even in Florida, is not super recent, but Biden was +3 over Trump. Bernie was up a similar margin over Trump the last time that poll was done. This is not a foregone conclusion. Trump could also win re-election, but this is just a matter of do we get the vote out? So when you hear me talk about this, please don't react by thinking, oh, we've got everything. We don't need to work. We don't need to vote. We don't need to go and get the vote out. The reaction should be, wow, Donald Trump is unpopular in many red states. If we work incredibly hard, if we mobilize people who already don't like Trump and agree with us on policy, but often don't vote, if we mobilize them to go out and vote, then we have a shot at some of these states. And that should be the attitude. And this polling only supports that view. If we don't get the vote out, none of this stuff matters. It becomes completely academic, and it becomes another 4 years of Donald Trump saying, the polls said this before the election, and I won again. I don't want that to happen. I know most people in the audience don't want that to happen. The opportunity is there. We've got to get the vote out.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've been talking with you for years at this point about the completely, utterly destructive nature of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's presence in Israeli politics. This is a guy who I've been saying for years just has to go. And there are many impediments to peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As many of you in the audience know, I've not been shy about naming all of them. But Benjamin Netanyahu is one of them. This is not a guy who wants peace in the sense that it doesn't benefit him politically to have serious discussions that might lead to a peace agreement. And I know there are plenty of other parties who also don't benefit from peace. But we're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu today. Netanyahu is heavily aligned with the most extreme religious elements of the Israeli political sphere. Almost everything that he does is counterproductive to the goal of a path to a long-lasting and permanent peace agreement, and he benefits from the status quo not being that and being one of threats and being on the verge of something all the time. So we heard yesterday Benjamin Netanyahu is going to make a big announcement. It is just going to be a huge, huge, huge announcement that he is going to be making, by the way, a week before the election in Israel. How exciting. And of course, I assumed it would be some horrible thing or some brazen distraction of some kind. And it was. Benjamin Netanyahu's big announcement is that if Israelis reelect him, he will take more land. He will annex pieces of the West Bank, much to the pleasure of people associated with Donald Trump's administration here in the United States. And in this particular case, Benjamin Netanyahu is talking about the Jordan Valley and the northern Dead Sea. The Trump administration, of course, was asked officially, do you support this idea? They simply said, our policy has not changed, but intimating that pretty clearly they're not going to get in the way of Benjamin Netanyahu doing this if he is indeed reelected. So this is a very brazen tactic from Netanyahu. We've seen this before. He's worried about losing. He's not polling well. It would be great for him to lose, by the way. So he has done what he always does. He has concocted this dramatic announcement riddled with red meat of different kinds, appealing to fears about terrorism and so on and so forth, which are not unfounded fears, but he appeals to them in an irrational way, which is not actually dramatic in the sense that he wanted it to be. It's just horrible. It's a horrible idea. He's done this before prior elections. It unfortunately does have an effect in the same way that here in the United States, sometimes you'll see Republicans before an election pull national security games. Oh, we've got a new recording from Osama bin Laden. Remember that? Very similar dynamic being employed in Israeli politics. So let's hope that he's voted out. Then maybe if Donald Trump is also voted out, we can make some progress towards an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, the parameters of which, as I see them, I've laid out many times on the program. But again, it is also more than just removing Benjamin Netanyahu, as I've talked about before. There is much more to it, including having Donald Trump, a Benjamin Netanyahu sycophant, in the White House in the United States. Now, one impediment that I've talked about many times is not the annexation specifically, but settlements. And the way that this always works with these annexations is Israel says, you know, we need to create a defensive buffer between Palestinian territory and Israeli territory. So we need this little stretch of land here. It's just a small stretch of land. They take it, and then settlers go into those buffer zones, which moves the perimeter at which yet another buffer zone is supposedly needed, which justifies or at least creates the pretext for Benjamin Netanyahu to again say, listen, we've got to have a protective buffer in now this new line that has been drawn. The settlements have to stop. They're one of the biggest impediments to peace, big picture. And I know you all know this. A ton of stuff has to change. It is not just Israeli policy that has to change. On the Palestinian side, there is a long list of policies and people and practices and status quo that will never lead to peace. And I've been clear about it. I've not been shy about saying that. But this game that Benjamin Netanyahu is playing is completely backwards. So let's hope that the promise of this dramatic annexation of more West Bank land ends up being nothing more than a naked electioneering attempt, and that Benjamin Netanyahu will lose and thus not even have the chance to make good on this promise, because it will only lead to more of the same and more of what we've been seeing under this guy's numerous administrations over the years. So it is today the 18th anniversary of 9/11. It's incredible. It has actually been more than half of my life has been lived after 9/11 than before 9/11, which is incredible. It's also incredible just how fast time passes. And with each passing year since 9/11, since the program has existed, I have been increasingly unsure, I guess I would say, or kind of just ambivalent about what should we be doing? Should we just be doing the same thing every 9/11 anniversary, more or less? I don't know. it's actually been a few years since we've even talked about it, because for the last several anniversaries, I just didn't really have anything new to add. So what I want to think about today is I will retell the story of where I was on 9/11, which I remember vividly, although behavioral economists and others would say my memory of this has deteriorated over the years and it is no longer accurate. But you can go back and check, contrast with the first time I told the story. And then I also want to talk about the sort of legacy of 9/11 as I now see it. So on the morning of 9/11, I was in high school. And I was sitting in psychology class with a teacher of mine who I really liked, Donald Palmisano, who sadly is no longer with us. He actually passed away not that long ago. And I got the chance to see him out in Western Massachusetts at an event a few years ago. And I remember his wife actually came up to me, having heard my description of my 9/11 morning, and said, you know, when I heard you tell that story, I asked him, do you think it really went down that way? And he said, you know, I don't remember, but it sounds sort of like how it would go down. So I was sitting in psychology class, and a student who was sort of a regular troublemaker, whose name I forgot, I think his name might have been Eric. And it's amazing that the student's name I've forgotten. He was always out of his seat and always walking around in the halls. He had gone to the bathroom and he came back into the room agitated and interrupted psychology class and said to Mr. Palmisano, "We're under attack. It's happening in New York. Things are crazy, more or less, just saying we're under attack. The country's under attack." And Mr. Palmisano looked at him in the context of, this is a guy who's always interrupting class and sort of a troublemaker and not particularly well behaved, and just didn't believe it and said, you know what? I'm sure everything's fine. Please just sit down. And of course, we later found out that it was true. And I don't think that there was early dismissal, but I certainly went home and was just watching TV the rest of the day. And the following day, Mr. Palmisano actually apologized to the student and said, you know what? You were right. I apologize for how I reacted, and it's horrible what's happened. And we just had a conversation in psychology class about what had gone on. Since then, with each passing year, in some senses, our perspective on what took place changes and evolves, partially just because when things are less recent, our point of view is altered. I don't think any of us can control this. Also, partially because we know more about what the legacy has been. And for me, unfortunately, the legacy of 9/11 in the United States has been pretty bad. We started a war in the wrong place as a result of 9/11 against people who didn't do the thing that we claimed was the reason for starting the war. We have seen pervasive, persistent, and also ineffective privacy invasions as a result of 9/11 under the guise of national security. We've seen the Patriot Act, we've seen NSA surveillance, all of that stuff that we've talked about over the last many years post 9/11 that the David Pakman Show has been going on. We have become really accustomed to the persistent state of the global war on terror, the permanent war status quo of we're always somewhere. For many years, it's been Afghanistan, a presence in Iraq that never seems to end, other potential engagements, all sort of under this post 9/11 mentality of we've got to make sure that people out there who want to harm us aren't able to do it, and that we're projecting strength and all of this stuff. One of the elements of the legacy of 9/11, sort of the high points, not in terms of them being morally good or bad, but just notable, was the Obama administration capture of Osama bin Laden. And then, of course, subsequently, everything we learned about the lead up to that and the people that were involved. We've seen a legacy of continued ignorance, and it's really more than ignorance. It's really more of a deliberate kind of burying our heads in the sand, many of us, about what creates radicalism through foreign policy. And this is not, very often when we talk about foreign policy creating radicals who want to attack the United States, it becomes a very sort of Manichaean white-black thing of, listen, either people are responsible for choosing to attack the United States, or you're saying that they lack all responsibility and it's just the fault of the U.S. through foreign policy for radicalizing people. And of course, the answer is no. That's not the black and white scenario that anyone who's thoughtful is trying to lay out. One of the things we've hopefully learned over the 18 years since 9/11 is that radicalization, both domestically and geopolitically, whether we're talking about white supremacy or Islamic extremism or whatever the case may be, is a combination of circumstances domestically, which are influenced by the foreign policies of superpowers like the United States, combined with the particular predispositions and circumstances of individuals. All of the white supremacists and former white supremacists I've interviewed on the show have told a very consistent story about how they know who is sort of ripe for radicalization and indoctrination. And in the same way, when we talk about Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever, we're not excusing the actions of individuals when we say we should consider the role that the relationships between countries and American foreign policy have on creating an environment ripe for radicalization, while understanding that millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people on the planet are not apt to be radicalized, regardless of foreign policy. These things are not black and white. And hopefully, if there's a positive legacy from 9/11, and I know that for a lot of people, this just doesn't work, but hopefully the more thinking people are aware of this stuff. Hopefully one of the positive legacies of 9/11, if there's anything to find in it, is that we have sort of deepened our understanding of the interaction between personal circumstances, personal responsibility, and geopolitical status quo in creating radicalization around the world. We also have seen continued neoconservative war hawking on a lot of the right and even on some of the left as a result of 9/11, in terms of even justifying attempted or would-be engagements in other parts of the world over the last 18 years. Airport security and the establishment of the TSA, of course, a major legacy of 9/11, and unfortunately, not one of the best ones. TSA failing to identify banned items in almost 95% of internal self-tests, drills, so to speak, of their security processes. So sadly, it is mostly negative. There was, I mean, if we want to find something that was sort of good that happened after 9/11, that of course doesn't outweigh any of the bad, there was actually a short-lived positive sort of sense of unity in the United States where hyperpartisanship was mitigated a little bit, and it was about coming together as a country and helping people in New York City and in Washington, D.C., and all of the people affected by 9/11. And it didn't last long, and it's not surprising that it was these sort of black swan type events, to take a term from Nassim Taleb, who has written about such events, that really kind of shook up the status quo. It didn't last very long. And of course, then the administration of George W. Bush choosing to retaliate to 9/11 by going into Iraq, which had nothing to do with it, did not help at all. My question to you, how should we be remembering 9/11 as we get closer and closer to 20 years out from the event, which is just incredible that almost 20 years have gone by? And what do you see as the legacy of 9/11 on geopolitics, on United States foreign policy, domestic issues, and the status quo? I want to hear from you. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a really interesting voicemail from about what waitstaff is doing when MAGA hat-wearing Trumpists come in and have a meal at this particular restaurant. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, how's it going? I'm calling from Missoula, Montana, one of the more liberal bubbles maybe in Montana. But I had an interesting thing happening at my work lately, and that's that some of my employees are actually, we work in the service industry, and they work for tips, and we've kind of started this thing at my work where people come in wearing their MAGA hats, or we have certain local Republican politicians that come and dine with us. My servers they're pledging the tips from those tables towards Bernie Sanders' campaign. Anyways, I thought this was kind of a cool idea and didn't know if you'd be interested in maybe promoting this to some of your listeners on your show, that they could be donating service tips from Trump supporting people or Republican politicians towards a progressive candidate of their choice.
Listen, I absolutely love the idea. This is extraordinary. So Missoula, Montana, it's a red state, but Missoula is a little bit more of a purple or bluish enclave within the state. People come in wearing MAGA hats rather than treating them poorly or spitting in their food or whatever the waitstaff says. The tips we get from the MAGA hat wearing people and from the known Republican politicians, we will take and donate to the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who we believe will achieve progressive change that we like and that we are in favor of. I love it. I also understand that when you're getting paid $2.63 an hour, I believe it is in some places, plus tips, the last thing I'm going to do is tell waitstaff that they should jeopardize potentially their own financial well-being by donating the tips from Republican customers to Bernie Sanders. So I love the idea. And I think if more people in the dining industry and the service industry want to do it, absolutely more power to them. But I also am extremely sensitive to the way in which so many people that work in the service industry are really poorly compensated, and partially on the backs of the idea that, hey, it should be okay for restaurant owners to pay them $2.63 an hour, because in the end, they're getting tips 15, 20% from some customers, less from others, more from others as well. So I am not going to suggest that they do anything with those tips other than use it to have hopefully in totality, a wage that is a living wage or approximating it. But I absolutely love the idea. We've got a great bonus show today where we'll talk about fighting picking up in Afghanistan after talks have collapsed. We will talk about a study that has found a correlation between daytime naps and heart health. But is it a causal relationship? And also, we see Nancy Pelosi trying to split Trump and Republicans over drug pricing in a way that, quite frankly, does not strike me as super effective. But we'll talk about it and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to access it: become a member at joinpacman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.